Respected Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum and a very good morning to one and all. I'm Komal Farouk and I feel privileged to welcome you all on behalf of NEPRA. Today, we are holding this webinar, Geothermal Energy, Technological Overview and Potential, under the leadership of our Honorable Chairman, Mr. Tosif H. Faruqi. And we hope you will find this webinar we have lined up for you to be fruitful, informative, and engaging. We would like to acknowledge the presence of our guest speaker, Dr. Amanda Kolker, who has joined us today. We welcome and thank you for joining us. We shall start our event with the recitation of Holy Quran.
अल्लाह के नाम से जो बड़ा मेहरबान निहायत रहम वाला है। सूरत अल इखलास।
कुल हुवल्लाहु अहद।
आप कह दीजिए कि वो अल्लाह एक है।
अल्लाहुस समद।
अल्लाह बेनियाज है।
लम यलिद वलम यूलद।
न उसकी कोई औलाद है और न वो किसी की औलाद है।
वलम यकुल लहू कुफुवन अहद।
और कोई उसका हमसरो बराबरी करने वाला नहीं है।
सदक़ल्लाहुल अज़ीम।
Jazakallah. Now I request Mr. Chairman NEPRA to please share his opening remarks.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I hope I'm laudable. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, sir.
First of all, thank you very much, my team, Athar and all the others, Bhutto, for helping organize this today's session on geothermal. I would like to give this message to everybody that your regulator, the Power Regulatory Authority of Pakistan, NEPRA, we are quite upbeat about introducing the new technologies. When I took over as chairman about 3 years and 2 months back, I divided this sector not in 3, generation, transmission, and distribution, but in 4 subsectors. The fourth being the innovation. And you guys might remember that we had an energy week in which we celebrated all these 4 subsectors, and innovation is definitely the key. Generally, I speak a lot, but on this particular topic, since this is a new technology, I don't have much to add. The only thing I would say is that I found a lot of excitement in the market as soon as I advertised on my LinkedIn that we are about to have a session on geothermal. I was amazed to see the response. Just yesterday, 2 different companies came to see me. One was Schlumberger, a very famous oil exploring company. And the second one is my University of Engineering and Technology junior. His name is Tariq. He has got a new startup on geothermal. Both these companies and individuals are also participating in today's session. But both and the Schlumberger guys, they also brought one of their top shots from Turkey. His name was Tawfiq. And they mentioned that Turkey doesn't have any oil and gas resources. Even then, they are right now having almost 1.7 gigawatt hours or almost 1700 megawatts of installed capacity on geothermal. So Mr. Tawfiq, he was extremely confident that Pakistan having oil and gas reserves, we must be having a lot bigger potential, even though few estimates say that Pakistan has a potential of around 1000 megawatts, but he was pretty confident that they not having any oil and gas reserves in Turkey, still if they can reach, they started in 2017 with first well or first geothermal facility. Now in 2022, they have already reached 1.7 gigawatts. So there are many areas in Pakistan, especially Sindh area is full of this geothermal potential. Also in Balochistan, one of the biggest provinces that we have, and we have lots and lots of untapped potential there. For the benefit of our speaker, Pakistan is a very unique country. Almost 60% of our population is less than 30 years of age, and more than 30% of our population is going to be less than 15 years of age. So we are going to be a very, very young generation or very young population, which is very rare in the world, because generally the countries are having very old population. Secondly, the per capita consumption right now in Pakistan is only 450 kilowatts, which is peanuts compared to, let's say, Europe, 5,500, and many countries even 10,000 plus. So Pakistan has long way to go. We need to find out the challenges we are facing right now is energy security, because you have all seen this Ukraine war. Even though Pakistan is far from there and we had absolutely nothing to do with that, the after effects of that are catastrophic in Pakistan as well. Because as we all know, the international coal prices, fuel prices, may it be liquid fuel, or may it be imported coal or RLNG or furnace oil, the prices have skyrocketed. Like 3 years back, when I joined as chairman NEPRA, the imported coal price was like $50 per ton, and it went as high as $450 per ton. So secondly, our rupee has been constantly devaluating, so it has gone down to almost half since last 3 years. So my simple mathematics tell me that our input cost has increased by 16 times. So we can't afford as a country spending in dollars. So imported fuel based projects is a no-go area for us going forward. So as you know, we have brought IGSAP, indicative generation capacity expansion plan, and we have also opened up the Pakistan's wholesale market through CTBCM. So the focus is indigenous fuel based projects and no taker pay projects, because the current IPPs, we are facing a lot of challenges on that front. So considering this, geothermal and other technologies, like 2 weeks week back, we had a seminar on hydrogen, production of power through hydrogen. So your regulator is very upbeat about introducing new technologies. Will be more than happy to consider upfront tariff to lure or to make it more lucrative for the investors. And I'm very happy to know that when Schlumberger came to see me, they told me that Mari Petroleum, one of the oil and gas companies in Pakistan, and OGDCL, Oil and Gas Development Authority Limited, they are also very upbeat in diversifying into the and venturing out in power sector. So with these new players, and yesterday Bhutto Saab shared an article with us on NEPRA News that SSGC is also contemplating exactly the same, venturing out in power as well. And Pakistan is also having a lot of potential, in a sense that not only we have a potential of new wells, but we also have existing wells which have sort of dried up for the oil and gas exploration, but they are perfect and half-cooked dishes as far as geothermal energy is concerned. So we'll be more than happy to give rise or to give a pat on the back of the new investors. So we'll be happy to probably also consider in the new IGSAP as well, by offering them upfront tariff. So with this, I close my talk, and I have no words to thank Dr. Amanda Kolkar. She's from National Energy Laboratories, and let me hand over the stage to her, and thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Farouk, and thank you to NEPRA for having me talk here today. Let me share my slides. Sorry.
Dr. Amanda, if I just borrow 1 second of your time, I am in a meeting. I've come to another city called Karachi, and I'm just starting a meeting in a few minutes' time. So you please go. I'll be done with this meeting. I'll join you. And if not, then please, my audience and a lot of people on the Zoom are awaiting your talk. Thank you very much. Very nice meeting you. Cheers.
Thank you so much, Mr. Farouk. Again, thank you, NEPRA. Thank you to USAID for this opportunity to speak with you today about geothermal energy. The title of this presentation is Technology Overview and Potential. Just a quick word on USAID. USAID is the primary foreign assistance arm of the United States government. And USAID works along with the US State Department, implementing programs of technical and financial assistance to US allies supporting economic growth and development. And so that's who is supporting this work today. Thank you for that. A word about me. I am the program manager for geothermal technologies at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, or NREL. I work on geothermal integration into renewable energy strategy and deployment efforts. I'm also a research scientist. I lead international projects on a broad spectrum of geothermal energy topics. I have a PhD in geology. My expertise is in geothermal exploration and resource characterization, and sustainable production of geothermal resources in the United States and abroad. My agenda today will consist of 4 parts. So I'll first give a very general technology overview. What is geothermal? And then I will go into what are geothermal resources and what is the potential for geothermal. And then I have a section on geothermal resources and opportunities in Pakistan. And lastly, I will close with just a couple recommendations for geothermal development in Pakistan that come from USAID. So geothermal technologies. At the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, we consider 3 main categories of geothermal technologies. The first is geo-exchange. And in this cutaway of the earth that you see, I don't know if you can see my cursor. In the audience, can you see my cursor here?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can see.
Great, thank you. So geo-exchange is something that happens in the very shallow subsurface of the earth, shown over here in this little cartoon of a heat pump. And so typically geo-exchange doesn't need any type of geothermal resource. It really just uses the constant temperature of the shallow subsurface of the earth to heat and cool buildings, typically an individual home, sometimes a larger district of buildings. And you really don't need any particular geothermal resource to do this. You can do this anywhere in the world. Next type of geothermal technologies is using heat extraction from deeper parts of the earth. And so you can use heat extraction directly to heat buildings, or you can use it to produce electricity. So direct use of geothermal heat is shown over here as a deeper well that brings up typically hot fluid into a network of buildings for a district heating system. You could also use it to heat agricultural applications or industrial applications. And then lastly, like I said, you can also, if the resource is hot enough within depths that you can drill to, you can use geothermal resources for electricity. And so this is just a cartoon here about 2 different types of electrical production from geothermal resources that I'll talk to later. For more information, you can go to the United States Department of Energy's website. They have a study called the GeoVision. That's what this graphic is from. And it gives all sorts of good information of overviews of different types of geothermal technologies. So today I will talk mostly about direct use and geothermal electricity because Pakistan is one of those fortunate countries that has the opportunities for both. Pakistan also has opportunities for geo-exchange, as I mentioned, everywhere does, with some exceptions. But I won't be focusing in on this today. So what can we do with geothermal resources? We can do a lot of things. Let's start at the bottom of the thermometer. This image is also from that GeoVision study. If you start at the bottom of the thermometer, we have 10 degrees to 38 degrees C, or up to 100 degrees Fahrenheit. As I said, you don't need any type of geologic setting or a particular resource to be able to do some of these applications. This is just heat exchange, and you're taking advantage of the constant temperatures of the earth to do things like geothermal heat pumps. You can also use geothermal heat pumps, not just for heating, but for things like fish farming. You can use them for cooling. And then as you go up the temperature and typically go down into Earth's subsurface, and the Earth gets hotter with depth, And you can use these resources for direct use, such as agriculture, like greenhouses, industry, like concrete block drying. You can use it for food processing, all sorts of different other industrial uses as you go up the thermometer here. And as you go up the thermometer, you start getting into this power technology. I'll talk in a minute about the difference between binary geothermal power plants and flash and dry steam geothermal power plants. Once you get to the top of this thermometer, you get into supercritical hot water resources, which are actually being explored for geothermal power production as well. But technology today sort of stops at this 371 C limit, because that is where water turns supercritical and it becomes a little bit more difficult to utilize. And so these are what we consider heat extraction technologies, everything above ambient temperatures. And then at the bottom is heat exchange technology. So again, I will focus on heat extraction today, because Pakistan is fortunate to have all of these types of resources. So how do we produce geothermal power? There are three types of conventional technologies to do power production. And actually, some of these are new technologies and some of these are actually very old technologies. This dry steam technology over here on the left actually has been in existence since 1906, where it was proved, the concept was proved in Larderello, Italy, where they have dry steam coming out of the ground. They pull the steam up in a production well, and they send it directly through a turbine to generate the power, and then condense that steam back into a fluid and then re-inject it into a geothermal aquifer. So this is why geothermal resources are renewable, because you typically try to have a closed loop where you maintain your reservoir at depth. These type of resources are rare, though. There's one in Italy. There is a resource like this in the United States, where we have the biggest geothermal power plant in the world. There's some resources like this in Indonesia, but they're really exceptional. So the next type of power plant is this flash steam power plant. And here, this is able to use hot water. So you produce hot water from depths, same way you would produce steam, except that at the surface, you flash the steam, you flash the water into steam, and you separate out the steam and do the same process. You recombine the condensed fluid as well as the fluid fraction back into your injection well. So those are similar technologies, and those allow for hot water or hot steam to be used. Binary cycle power plants were invented rather recently in the last few decades, and these allow for resources at a lower temperature to be utilized for power. So you can bring up fluids that are even not quite at boiling point and send them through a heat exchanger and boil a secondary fluid. And that secondary fluid then runs the turbine rather than your geothermal resource directly through a heat exchanger. And so that's why it's called binary, because you've got these two different fluids. So those are your conventional technologies for producing power. An unconventional way to produce power is actually to use geothermal resources that are co-produced with oil and gas. And this is of particular interest to Pakistan. So I'm going to spend a little time on this today. This is a graphic that comes from 2010 from the United States Department of Energy. So it's not a new concept, but I would say it's newly of interest because of worldwide decarbonization goals and changing markets. Co-produced geothermal resources are derived from using hot water that's recovered from oil and gas wells to generate power, or to just generate heat if that's needed. I'm not sure what the numbers are in Pakistan, but in the US, we have 20 million barrels of hot water annually produced from oil and gas wells. And this hot water is largely seen as an inconvenience, and it requires costly disposal. And this hot water could be used to produce electricity, or that electricity could be sold to the grid, or it could be used for on-site field operations, resulting in energy savings, reduced greenhouse gas emissions, and it also extends the economic life of oil and gas fields. And the potential from oil and gas fields in the US is high. In Pakistan, it is also high. Not every oil and gas field is hot enough. But as I said, in Pakistan and also in the US, we have these very exceptional, I shouldn't say very exceptional, but quite high grade hot water coming out of our oil and gas basins, which is not the case for all oil and gas basins. There's many dry ones. So in the Gulf region of the US, for example, we have certain fields producing up to 50,000 barrels a day of fluid. So there's many ways you can do this. So you can, like I said, just simply co-produce it, where you have oil and gas or hydrocarbons coming up a well, and you separate out the water and use it for geothermal power or heat and re-inject it. You could also actually convert wells to solely geothermal uses. And this is what's being looked at in Europe today, where you take marginal or stripper wells for co-production, or you can deepen existing wells and get into a deeper, hotter geothermal reservoir. And then another really interesting technology that's being looked at is using converted oil and gas wells for geothermal production by deepening them. And then also when you're re-injecting your fluid, sequestering carbon with that. Another unconventional technology, something called EGS. EGS stands for Enhanced Geothermal Systems. So your typical geothermal resource, if you want a naturally upwelling source of hot fluid, you need permeable pathways in the subsurface. You need a source of fluid to carry the heat energy, and you need heat. Now, this heat part is ubiquitous in the earth. As you get deeper into Earth's subsurface, it gets hotter. We all know that. But these two parts are a little bit trickier. Not every place in the earth has either the fluid or the permeable pathways to bring up that fluid. So an unconventional technology for producing power from geothermal heat, where you don't have the fluid and pathways, is to create these reservoirs. And this is something that the United States Department of Energy has been doing a lot of investment in research and development on, because this could allow geothermal resources to be produced from zones where they aren't currently. And these create fractures in hot, deep rock underground. By injecting a cool fluid in the earth, and through thermal contraction, you create these flat fractures, and then you produce the fluid back to the surface. And again, you can use it for electricity or heating. There's also another emerging type of technology that is also trying to solve this problem of most places in the earth having heat, but not having the permeable pathways or the fluid. And this is a type of technology called closed loop or advanced geothermal systems, also known as AGS. And these are just two schematics of two different ways that companies are thinking about doing this. These are just from various company websites. I took these schematics. So this is over here, describes a natural geothermal system, or perhaps a created one like I just described. Over here, this shows the closed loop concept. So instead of creating a reservoir, you are actually just using conduction through closed well piping to obtain the same type of heat exchange. And this is an emerging technology. It has not been commercially proven. It's not at the moment producing any megawatts in the world, but there are, as we speak, demonstrations happening in many countries. This is another concept where instead of having one closed loop, you have a series of multiple laterals that are interconnected to maximize heat exchange in the subsurface. So this is also something to keep an eye on when you are an oil and gas country transitioning to geothermal. One interesting thing you can do with geothermal is really get sort of two bangs for your buck, as we say, or kind of a double resource from one. So you have a geothermal reservoir, it's got heat in it. And the idea of cascaded use or combined heat and power is that you use the resource as many times as you can before you re-inject it. And so here's an example of a cascaded use system where you have a geothermal reservoir pumping up hot fluid. In this case, we have it at between 180 and 140 degrees C. So that's enough temperature to run a flash evaporation cycle or a binary cycle. And then from that power conversion, then you have an effluent of water that's not completely cooled down. It's at 100 to 80 degrees C, and you can recycle that off the sort of the effluent into other uses. So here's some examples. You can recycle that effluent into a modular geothermal desalination unit for desalinizing water. You can also cascade it into a chiller for cooling, for doing air conditioning or refrigeration. Just your normal absorption chiller cooling systems do work with geothermal heat. You can then, then once it's come off those processes, it still has heat in it, this fluid. So then you can run it through agricultural processes like food dehydration, greenhouse heating. You could use it for a fish farm, and then ultimately be recycling it back into the subsurface. And then lastly, I wanted to talk about some sort of modern geothermal heating and cooling technologies. And I'm showing a few examples of district heating that we're considering in the United States and Europe today. So district heating and cooling, or district energy, is a centralized production of heating and cooling, also coupled sometimes with domestic hot water and sometimes coupled with power, depending on the energy source. A sort of subset of district energy is something called a thermal energy network, and that's what's shown here, which is distributed production of thermal energy for heat exchange across a balanced network of loads and users. What that means is you have some buildings exchanging heat by dumping heat into a centralized system, and you have some buildings using that ambient system as a heat sink, and so cooling their buildings. This is just another illustration of a district energy concept. So these, like I said, they can be used for heating, they can be used for cooling, or they can be used for both, depending on the geothermal technology. They're most commonly used with geothermal heat pumps, but they can be done also with geothermal direct heat. Down here, I show a map of all the fossil-based district energy systems in the United States. That's what the red dots are fossil-based district energy systems that are now being considered for renewable retrofits. And we think geothermal could retrofit a lot of these. We're doing some work in the United States to look at that. Okay, so I've gone through some of the geothermal technologies. Like I said, I didn't focus too much on geothermal heat pumps. But now I'm going to talk about geothermal resources and the potential. There's really two main types of geothermal resources that we use to produce high enthalpy steam or water for power and also for heating. And we have one of them, at least in Pakistan, and that is a volcanic type, as shown here. And I won't go into all of the details here, but basically when you have a magma source and you have volcanic or a volcano, then you have circulating water that heats up and can actually have fairly extensive hot water aquifers around the volcano. So this is a type we do see in Pakistan. Deep circulation type, I'm not quite sure if this type is in Pakistan. That's something we'll talk about maybe at the end of this discussion, is better ways to understand the resource. This is a type that's used a lot in the United States for power. And this is when you have a type of tectonic setting where you have deep crustal faults allowing for deep circulation of hydrothermal fluids. And then these same faults or different ones are allowing the fluids to circulate back up at pretty high temperatures. So those are the two kind of common high enthalpy geothermal resource types. The next type is also something that we have in Pakistan. These are mid and low enthalpy or sort of medium temperature geothermal resources. And this is sedimentary basin. So sedimentary basin is also the type of geologic setting where we find oil and gas accumulations. And this is just a schematic showing a geothermal borehole and a sort of a permeable layer allowing geothermal fluids to circulate and how that recharge is happening. Over here, what you see is a typical gradient of a geothermal well in a system like this. And you can see the gradient is pretty linear. as opposed to some other types of resources where the gradient is more curved, where it gets hotter with depth at a certain level. So the last type is the orogenic type, and that's where you have a big, large mountain belt or mountain range, and you have a lot of meteoric recharge going into mountains and recirculating as sort of small scale hydrothermal resources in foothills and in foreland basins. So all of these resource types exist in Pakistan. The challenge with geothermal resources is it's very hard to classify or assess on a national scale, because really to understand what's going on in the deep subsurface, you need to drill wells. So, you know, in some ways, Pakistan is exceptional because there are a lot of wells drilled in Pakistan relative to other places where there hasn't been a lot of hydrocarbon production. But there's still a lot of unknowns in the subsurface. So what I'm showing here are two maps, a map of the geothermal resources of the United States. And you can see this, the color code has to do with the relative favorability for hydrothermal and also enhanced geothermal in the United States. And so the warmer the colors, the more favorability there is for these types of resources. In the east part of the United States, there are still potential for geothermal technologies through geothermal heat pumps. But in the west is really where most of the geothermal resources are in the United States. And you can see in Pakistan, this is a map showing the different geothermal areas. And there's this map from the Geological Survey of Pakistan shows several areas of geopressured geothermal resources, as well as areas with hot springs. And then over here we have an area with volcanic geothermal resources. But you can see the rest of the country hasn't been well classified in terms of its geothermal resource. So there's still a lot of unknowns, and there's still a lot of challenges with basic assessments of resources in Pakistan. Okay, so I just wanted to share with you, before I get into specifics about Pakistan, some of the potential we see in the United States for geothermal. Our vision at NREL is that geothermal provides both heat and power 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, increasing grid reliability and security with the smallest footprint of any renewable. So we see geothermal technologies as key to deep decarbonization of both our thermal and electrical systems in the United States. At the National Renewable Energy Lab, we are a research institution. So our research challenges with geothermal have to do with 6 main pillars. The first is reducing costs, because geothermal is a reliable and resilient technology, but it is not the cheapest. And that might be a little bit different when you are looking at co-production or repurposing of oil and gas infrastructure. But when you're drilling geothermal wells from scratch, as you will, it is not the cheapest technology. So some of our research challenges are reducing costs and enabling geothermal anywhere through new technologies. Another research challenge is decarbonizing buildings, industry and agriculture using geothermal heating, cooling, and storage technologies. We're also looking at integrating subsurface storage with renewable energy generation, and you can do subsurface storage with geothermal as well as developing and validating hybrid geothermal systems, and looking at how geothermal systems foster grid resilience, but with both heat and power technologies. And then another thing we're looking at is using geothermal fluids for mineral production. So geothermal brines can have lithium in them, for example. And now with electric cars, lithium is starting to be a large market. And so we're looking at economic recovery of lithium and other critical minerals from geothermal fluids. So here's our vision at NREL, is that geothermal is really an integrated energy solution. So back to your geothermal reservoir at depth, you can bring up the fluid for direct use of the heat. In places where you want power, you can either directly produce power if the fluids are hot enough, or if they're not, you can hybridize it with solar or other technologies to boost the temperature to get resource to be able to produce electricity. You can do heat exchange, like I mentioned before. If you also, you can do chilling with geothermal for cooling. And then, like I mentioned, you could do mineral production and storage from the subsurface. And then we're also looking at how geothermal reservoirs can absorb carbon dioxide and how we can sequester it using the leveraging the fact that we are already injecting fluid into subsurface reservoirs for geothermal. In sum, geothermal is not resource limited. It's a provider of power and heating and cooling. It's always available, independent of the weather. It's a higher cost, but a high value complement to solar and wind electricity. So this little graph over here shows the capacity factor of the different renewable technologies. So solar photovoltaics typically have about 20% capacity factor, meaning from your solar panels, you get solar electricity about 20% of the time. Wind has about 45% capacity factor. Geothermal has typically around a 90% capacity factor. And so we think that geothermal is a really good complement to renewable technologies that are more variable, and they can help, as I said, stabilize grids and provide resilience as a base load and dispatchable renewable energy for power and heating and cooling. The other thing about geothermal is that it's able to reduce demand on the electrical grid by supplying heating and cooling that would otherwise either have to be supplied by fossil sources or by electrification through technologies that would stress the grid in the future. Lastly, geothermal is able to help address energy resilience, energy security, energy equity, job security, and environmental and climate justice. So in the United States, we think geothermal can do big things. The US Department of Energy predicted that by 2050, geothermal can produce up to 8.5 of all of the US generation. And as Mr. Farouk alluded to, we are large consumers of energy in the United States, the largest in the world. So 60 gigawatts gets us to about 8.5% of all of our generation. And that's a very steep curve because right now, today, it only produces less than 1%. Geothermal heating and cooling can also really help get us to our decarbonization goals. This study from the GeoVision predicted that by 2050, we could get to 28 million installation of geothermal heat pumps for individual buildings. And then for districts, and we only looked at heating in this study, not at cooling, we could do up to 17,500 installations by 2050. And this is all using current technology and looking at current commercial sort of the economics of the systems today. And so what that means is we would have up to, we would have lots and lots of avoided emissions from both electric and heating and cooling, basically equating to the removal of 26 million cars per year. So that is the geothermal potential in the United States. So let's talk about the geothermal resources and opportunities in Pakistan. So why are we talking about geothermal in Pakistan? Well, like I said, Pakistan's very lucky in the sense that it has some pretty interesting, it has a very interesting tectonic setting for geothermal. And then combined with, hydrocarbon production, we have some pretty good data on what's happening in the subsurface in certain parts of Pakistan. So in what you see on the left is the seismic or the plate boundary marking the convergence of the Indo-Australian plate and its collision into the Arabian plate and the Eurasian plate. And this creates all sorts of good geological conditions favorable for development of geothermal resources at depths where we could economically drill them. So over here, you see the different geologic features of Pakistan, and each one of these features is actually associated with its own type of geothermal resource. So if you remember those diagrams I showed you earlier, we've got sedimentary basin resources in this area. We've got orogenic resources in this area and in this area. And then we've got volcanic resources in this area. So like I said, all sorts of good possibilities in Pakistan. The next few slides are coming from a presentation that was put together by USAID in 2018 by Jeffrey Humber. And this gentleman identified several different types of geothermal sort of provinces in Pakistan. And so there's geothermal springs up here, up in the north. There's geothermal springs in this sort of north central valley, as well as a geothermal basin. And then, like I said, there's co-produced geothermal resources in the Sindh basin and the Punjab area. And again, these are co-produced geothermal waters in oil and gas fields. And then over here to the left, we also have more volcanic related resources. And then, as they point out, there's also the potential for shallow geothermal available for heat pumps throughout Pakistan. And like I said, it's very interesting that there's over 850 exploratory wells and over 1,000 development wells in Pakistan. And there's, as Mr. Farouk said in the beginning of this talk, there's a lot of abandoned wells that could be sort of given a new economic life through geothermal. And so this particular study thought that there was probably about 300 wells available today, well, in 2018, for geothermal energy development. So I want to go through a little bit of what's been done to assess the resource. This is from a paper from Zigan and Nayar. And this paper looked at two different methodologies for calculating the heat flow with depth in Pakistan, or well, in parts of Pakistan. And so one method is a method using satellite data. And this method shows something called earth skin temperature. And the takeaway here is that warmer colors are hotter. And so that is sort of consistent with some temperatures that were measured for these are actually geothermal gradients over here on the right that were measured in wells. And this is actually a little bit reverse. Here, the cooler colors are warmer temperatures or higher gradients with depth. So what's being shown here is the numbers are units in degrees Celsius per 100 meters. So that is, in this area, for example, it gets hotter quicker with depth versus out here. So this is about average. The yellow zones are about average thermal gradient, 2 to 2.5 degrees C per kilometer. And then in the middle here, we see that it's about double that. So much hotter subsurface. Here's some very preliminary estimates of the geothermal energy resources in Pakistan over here from Ahmad, 2014. So Ahmad divided the types of resources into co-produced and geopressured. And I guess I should say something about geopressured. Geopressured resources are what they sound like is when the geologic setting is causing hot water at depth to have pressures that are greater than what you typically expect for hydrostatic or lithostatic. And so they typically tend to come out of wells artisanally, which is nice. But a lot of times the downfall of geopressured fluids is that they can be highly saline. So anyway, the preliminary estimated resources just of the co-produced and geopressured alone is 40,000 megawatts of electricity. Of those, that's the technical potential, but the developable potential was estimated at 10,000 megawatts or by 2020. 15,000 by 2030, and other estimates. Hydrothermal is about, it's a little lower actually than the co-produced and geopressured estimate. And then deep geothermals, like what I was talking about with EGS or AGS, is around the same as hydrothermal. And then they also looked at thermal uses, not just electrical as well. And just, to give you a sense of some of the non-electrical uses that could be considered in Pakistan. There was a paper from 2017, Gondal et al., identifying lots and lots of different opportunities. And I think that's because the sort of industrial zones of Pakistan tend to be co-located with the hydrocarbon production. So I won't go through all of these, but just lots of really interesting opportunities related to specific locations and specific temperatures. So the co-production potential of Pakistan is enormous. We think that this Sindh Basin, as Mr. Farouk mentioned earlier, is highly prospective. It has a lot of oil and gas wells, many of which are abandoned, and a lot of heat. Why co-production Pakistan? Like I said, there's a lot of resource there. There's this one picture from an abandoned oil exploratory well near where you all are in Islamabad, and it's actually been flowing, I learned, since 1980 at over boiling point, over 100 degrees C. It has artesian pressure, so it's probably a geopressured resource, and it flows at 5,000 barrels a day was the data I got. And this well goes down into a sedimentary aquifer at 1,500 meters depth. So I won't go through all this data, but there's a lot of data from the Indus Basin. The basin has been split up into several sections, and I'll just call your attention to the temperatures here, which are really, they're not on the high enthalpy side, but they are sufficient for power production. They will not be probably producing hundreds of megawatts at these temperatures, but tens of megawatts is possible at these temperatures. Okay, so just wanted to jump into some quick recommendations for how geothermal development in Pakistan could accelerate. And I took these directly from some slides that were put together in 2018. So these are not from me, this is from my colleague, Jeffrey Humber at USAID. And this study presents recommendations that we very much agree with here at NREL. The first is to identify and review the available geothermal data from existing, abandoned, and capped oil and gas wells, also from the volcanic zones, and also from the fault zones. And basically, use those data to conduct an initial technical review of all of the different opportunities in 3 target markets. So the 3 target markets that were identified is grid scale geothermal production, geothermal co-production from oil and gas wells, and then potential direct use geothermal opportunities. Another recommendation was around developing short and medium term development strategies for subsequent deployment. If step number 2 is encouraging, then a study could quantify potentials of opportunities and develop priorities and strategy. If step number 2 indicates very limited potential, then you would have a go, no go and cease work. So let's move on. Assuming that number 2 showed that there were good opportunities in these target markets, then another step would be further analysis of selected high value opportunities. And then I won't go through the specifics on that, but because I wanted to focus a little bit on 5 and 6 here today, because I think this is something that particularly NEPRA would be interested in, is there were some recommendations around reviewing legal and regulatory framework or barriers to geothermal development specific to Pakistan, and also reviewing the commercial uses associated with geothermal development. What are the users and where are the demand bases? So with that, I conclude my presentation today, and I would be happy to take questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Amanda. So I think let's open the floor for the questions. Let's take any of the questions the audience in the hall have. Anyone having the question? If not, then let me to ask you. Wonderful presentation, enlightening a new technology, mature technology, and good that, like Chairman said, that in Pakistan, we don't have a lot of potential, but that need to be exploited. So Pakistan have ARE policy that promotes the new technology, including geothermals. Important is that policy is there, and like Chairman said, that the upfront tariff is missing. Probably the Chairman given the vision, and that can be given. Could you enlighten us what is the minimum or maximum size of the plant globally, and what is the tariff prevailing in the cents per kilowatt hour that can be worked out and an investor can think about?
Okay, I'll take the first question first. So thank you for that point. That was really interesting. Yes, so the minimum and the maximum size of the geothermal power plant is a great question because it's a huge range. The largest geothermal power plant in the world is here in the United States in California. It actually at some point was 2,000 megawatts, but actually the production has declined since then because the resource was not managed well. They did not re-inject the fluid for about several decades of production. So now they re-inject the fluid and their production has stabilized, but they spent their resource for a little while. So now that it's still about a gigawatt of production, which is still the largest power plant in the world. The smallest is, I would say, I think I've heard of a 25 kilowatt wellhead unit that some companies are putting on oil and gas wells for geothermal. That is, I think, the smallest size that I've heard. And so, but you have everything in between. In the United States, and this is partly technical and partly regulatory, we tend to like our power plants to be at about 50 to 100 megawatts.
Fine, and tariff range? Maybe you can consider what abandoned wells you talk about 600 into this in the area. What size, from your experience, you expect that on that abandoned well can be established? Maybe 10 megawatt, 15 megawatt. You touch upon that one. If this is the case, we have potential already because well is there. You have to put a plant. So what can be a recommended or range of a tariff for if policy and regulatory frameworks decides to go for the development of some abandoned wells? The tariff and size, what can be there?
So to answer your question about the induced basin, so when you produce lower temperature fluids like this, about around 100 C or up to 175 C, you need a higher volume of fluid. So the way that the binary cycle works is the hotter the fluid, the less you need to produce sufficient power, but the cooler the fluid, the more volume you want. So I can't tell you because it depends on how much flow you have out of these wells. I will say that one of the problems with producing oil and gas wells for geothermal is that they're typically smaller diameter than geothermal wells. So when we drill a well express, dedicated to geothermal, we're going to drill a much larger well than oil and gas wells. So typically you do get a lower flow rate out of oil and gas wells that have been repurposed. So we would have to look at the flow coming out for me to tell you. But at these temperatures, I would not expect it to be more than 5 or 10 megawatts per well, and likely much less, unless they're really, really flowing in a sort of anomalous way. But what you can do, you can combine all of the flow and produce multiple wells at a time to maximize your power production. And I think you had another question that I didn't quite catch. Can you restate the other question?
Other was the tariff and the size, like you said, that there's a 10 to 15 megawatt. What would be the viable tariff for that one? And then associated was who are the technology leaders, countries like in that geothermal? Two-part, tariff and technology leader.
Tariff. I'm not quite sure I'm understanding the question. I apologize. So I can answer about the technology leaders. So the country doing a lot of work right now around co-production is Colombia in South America. And then if you're asking about the countries that are producing some of the technology, A lot of there's a country. Let's see, there's some units sort for binary power conversion units are being sold out of the United States and Japan and other countries as well.
Thank you. So we go to the online. We are online. There is a Mr. Atif. Yes, Mr. Atif, your question. You can ask your question. Mr. Atif, can you hear us? Okay, next we have Mr. Shahid Ghani.
Thank you, Amanda, for the great presentation. I want to just ask one question, because a new technology and technology has its own pros and cons. There is an article I have read about geothermal thermal energy, especially Salton Sea. There is a study done by the UCSC in which Emily Brodsky and Santa Cruz has mentioned in that study that there is a strong correlation between extracting water from the field and the seismicity increased as the operations of the geothermal facility expanded. So what is your experience? Because it's a largest plant, I think 30 megawatt potential there. And that study is still, let's say, going on. There is a 30-year paradigm that they captured and then accordingly concluded that study. So with your experience, you see that Pakistan is also going a lot of calamities like floods and all these things. So we also need to take care that what are the possible actions that we could avoid those kind of repercussions as a result of utilizing geothermal energy and increasing the seismic activity around the high potential seismic areas.
Yes, thank you for the question. Yes, you're right. Some geothermal production comes with some seismic risk. It is not typical. So yes, in California, there's certain zones that are geologically very active, and there's a lot of debate about whether the geothermal production is actually enhancing seismicity or whether it was already such a naturally seismic zone that the seismic monitoring that was put in is picking up more of the seismic activity than they. But yeah, it's a highly controversial topic. It's not very black or white. There are definitely places, though, I would say there's definitely places where seismicity has happened from geothermal. It tends to be smaller magnitudes, less than magnitude 2 on the Richter scale. The only technologies that have really been associated with lots of high magnitude events is when you start creating the geothermal system. So in that technology, the new technology that I referred to as EGS, enhanced geothermal systems, where you're actually injecting a cold fluid to cause thermal fracturing, that is where some seismicity, on larger magnitudes has been seen. But yes, it's definitely absolutely something that Pakistan would have to consider, and there should be protocols in place for looking at what the natural seismicity is of the region that would be used for geothermal, and comparing, being very careful about operations and doing a lot of good monitoring around it. But, I would say in general, it's not a risk that poses lots of structural problems at the surface, because like I said, most of the seismicity is under magnitude 2.
I learned from these studies that these seismicity scale up to 5.1, and then when the operation expanded, it increased up to 8, because the water extraction sometimes increases to close to 8. So in that case, as far as the potential of the geothermal energy is concerned, there must be a correlation with the seismic zone and the potential that we can extract to minimize the seismicity in that particular area. Because even if we have a potential of 100 megawatt, for example, and then the scale, the zone under which the geothermal energy is being extracted, if we need to reduce the potential for the seismic activity in that area, might be we need to, let's say, limit that around 20-30 megawatt, not to the full potential, to reduce the operation and then to minimize the seismicity in that particular area. So do you have, do you recommend or you may suggest, because you see that people will be eyeing on this new technology, but it all depends on the experience of technologies around the world who has been capturing data for the last 30 years. So if you can enlighten us that the correlation between the seismicity factor as well as the magnitude of the project in a particular area.
I don't really have a great answer to that because I first of all, was not aware of this study, so I'd like to look at it. But I think that this is the thing about geothermal, is that each site is so specific, right? And each site is in an active, typically it's in a very active geologic zone. So there is a protocol that we have in the United States around seismicity in geothermal. It's pretty recent. It should have been enacted long ago. I would say in the last decade, there's a protocol around all the different steps you need to take as part of the environmental review process to understand what the background seismicity is, and then understand what the risk is. And as you said, sort of temper your production and maybe approach your production in a modular way so that you are making sure that you're not perturbing faults, that are active. So I'm not sure if there is, I know there's no baseline correlation we can make because every site is so different geologically.
Okay, Dr. Afzal, if you have any question, please, you can ask.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity. So, Dr. Kolkar, I have basically two questions. One is regarding the generation cost. So, how many cents per kilowatt hour if we use this geothermal technology for a medium-sized plant? And the second is this success rate. So, how sure we are, or how precisely we can predict that this plant is going, this site has enough potential, and this will last for this much time? Thank you.
Sure. Yes. So it depends on the technology, the cost, but the levelized cost of electricity right now for geothermal is about $6 to $7 per megawatt. So it's not one of the cheaper technologies, but the advantages of geothermal is that it has this high capacity factor, and it's basically base load. So you're paying sort of a premium to have this clean, renewable base load, so that even though it is one of the higher costs technologies, you still are seeing power purchase agreements happening at even higher rates than that. That's the market rate, but in places like California, in the United States, where they have a lot of variable renewable energy penetrating the grid, there are purchase agreements between utilities and developers that are happening at even higher cost than that. And the next question, sorry, it's late here. My brain is not working super well. What was the second question? I'm sorry, could you repeat
the second question was regarding the success rate, that how precisely we can predict that this site has this much potential and this will last for this much time.
Oh, yes, thank you. Okay, yeah, and I think those are two different questions. So the success rate in geothermal, let's talk about wells. So part of the problem with geothermal is siting and drilling, because where hot water occurs in the subsurface, it can be, especially if it's a fault controlled system, it can be anywhere from, say, 2 kilometers in one site. And then if the fault is almost vertical, you can imagine you go over, a kilometer over, and then your resource is actually at 3 kilometers depth or 4 or 6. So there's, in the past, there has been a lot of difficulty on and sort of poor success rate in drilling new geothermal wells. And that's why I think technologies like co-production, where you already have wells in the ground, are so important to look at, because your success rate of siting a new well is 100% if your well is already there and you already are producing hot water from it, right? So I think that I had heard at some point it was about a 40% success rate for drilling. So for every 10 wells that are drilled for geothermal, only 4 of them will actually give you hydrothermal fluid. But like I said, there's sort of a lot of new technologies that are trying to make the success rate better. So if you drill a dry well, those 6 wells that they drilled for hot water that are dry, could we do some of those more emerging technologies in those wells? So yes, 40% is for hydrothermal. And then the question about duration of these systems is a great one, because there, like I said, there's that system in Italy that first produced power in 1906, that it's actually now a big geothermal power plant that's still expanding. So you can argue that that's been in production for over a century and expanded. There are plants that have been running for over 60 years. I would say that the majority of the United States actually put in the majority of about 100 power plants in the United States were put in the 70s. And so, and most of them have been running for about 40, 45 years now. So it's a long duration investment.
So the question is how precisely we can predict that this site is going to last for this much time?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's a science that I think is still being worked out. I mean, in one way, this is a mature technology, but in another way, it hasn't had the market share that hydrocarbons have. So the technology hasn't advanced as quickly. And I think, one of the ways this entire industry needs to improve is to sort of streamline its exploration and how we assess resources. So yeah, that's still, I think, something, as we see with the maps that we looked at, not just for Pakistan, but all over the world, the level of the resource assessment is pretty poor.
Thank you.
So if anyone else has any question? So, Mubisab, you have question? Okay. Abdullah, you have? Please, mic then.
There's a question regarding the cost. What I heard, you said $6 to $7 per megawatt hours. So is that correct, or is it $60 to $70?
Yeah, sorry, $60 to $70. Sorry.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you. Anyone else has? Darsab, still you have any question? Because you have raised that. I think in the chat, we go to the chat and there are certain few questions in the chat. Since we have other 2 minutes, 5 minutes, we can close. Anyone in the chat? Any question? Can you mention about the life of geothermal projects like wind, solar? We give tariff for 15 years, 25 years. What's the life of geothermal project?
Right. I mean, economically, we typically budget for 30-year lifetime, but as I said, these plants can just go and go and go and go. There's some that are over 100 years old, lots that are over 60 years old. Some of them do decline over time, like I mentioned. I tend to say that that's more about sustainable management of the field. And I agree with the point that was made earlier about, making sure that you understand what your reservoir is to be able to sustainably produce it so that it can last, its maximum life, rather than overproducing it, because it is a renewable resource and it does need to be recharged. So, 30 years is how we frame it economically, but it's not the life of a system. They're usually much longer.
Thank you, Ms. Amanda, for your valuable insight. And that's it for today. Thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Now I will request Mr. Gul Hassan Bhutto for closing remarks.
So thank you everyone for joining this webinar. I mean, to close that one, the expert we learned today from the expert that do not forget to refer to the DOE Geo Vision 2019 to read, get it from their website. We learned about the technologies that she was talking about, dry, flash, and then binary cycles and all together. And then she gave us the global perspective of geothermal deployment. And then we learned about that the technology leaders like Colombia, Japan, South America, and all together. And we mostly key takeaway that we learned that in Pakistan has in every province, there is a potential of a geothermal. And that can be easily I mean exploited, and then in two forms, whether as a thermal output or whether as a power output. Key takeaway other was that there are the sense of the abandoned well in the oil and gas field that can be tapped. Maximum or minimum size 10 to 15 to 20 megawatt plants can be put over there. We explore about the life of the project, we tariff about the project, and all together. And then moving forward, like Chairman NEPRA gave the vision that in-field policy has ARE policy 2019 has mandated for the development of new technology. Future is to put into the IGSAP and then look for the upfront tariffs. With this, we thank you, Ms. Mananda, for your, I mean, insightful discussion and presentation. It was really interactive and very much beneficial. We look forward to contact you in future for the further evolution and taking it further for the detailed sessions. Thank you very much for the participant and especially you being with us on igniting the thirst for that new technology and moving forward for the development. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.